The thing that bothers me the most is just so many children that is being brutalized and killed by the police. Hopefully we can help another kid and another family not go through something like this.
Yet again, Black parents grieve a son's death from police brutality. It's a story that dates back to the very origins of America, and it's a history that conservatives are fighting very, very hard to eliminate from our schools. Also tonight, the unanswered questions in Tyre Nichols' death and the police chief responsible for hyper-aggressive police units with names like Scorpion and Red Dog. We begin tonight with the fallout over the tragic death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of 5 Memphis police officers. Now, if you have a heart, what happened to the 29-year-old father, skateboarder, FedEx driver, and amateur photographer should outrage you. It should shock and disgust you, as should the so-called brothers who chose to behave like a little blue gang rather than as Black men. But it damn sure shouldn't surprise you. What happened to Tyre Nichols was as American as apple pie. From the start, the European colonies in the Americas were designed to produce 2 kinds of people, subjects and citizens. And violence was at the center of it all. Even once they left Europe in the early 17th century, the colonizers of this continent remained the subjects of the European kings. Their citizenship existed at the pleasure of the monarchies of England, Spain, and France. Whatever your wealth or land holdings, if you were not the king, you were his subject. But with an ocean between them and the kings, their courts and their armies, these European lords in America increasingly yearned to live free of that status. In this vast, beautiful land wrested through extreme violence from the grasp of the indigenous, every man could be a king, the citizen of a new republic, invested with natural rights and subjects of his own, his wives, his daughters, his indentured servants, and his slaves. But holding hostage thousands of African men, women, and children, strong and hardy enough to have survived the stress and disease of being shipped like kindling across the ocean in the searing hot sun of the plantation fields, particularly in the large numbers a plantation required, came with tremendous risks. The most pressing being uprisings and rebellions on plantations where white slaveholders were often quite outnumbered. And unlike the history that you learned in school, slave uprisings were constant from not long after 1619 right through the Civil War. And they happened everywhere, from New York to Virginia to South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida. No matter what the planters did, these Africans just wouldn't stop resisting and trying to free themselves. Keeping the unpaid workers on the plantation and from violently overthrowing the system and maybe physically harming the people who claimed to own them required extraordinary violence. And so the planters created slave patrols, drawn from a social station below the planter class, almost all white, but every so often a handful who were Black, who could control the enslaved, threaten them with whippings or death in order to keep them from running away, catch them when they did, and instill the kind of terror required to put down rebellions and keep Black captives from rebelling as they endured rape, forced human breeding, physical brutality, and the selling of their children. In short, the planters invented the police. And the violence was the training. The violence was the point. And as the planter class grew richer and more determined to shed the last vestige of the kings, the taxes that cut into their slave-generated wealth, the situation came to a head. In Virginia, in 1775, here is a clip from the 1619 Project documentary on Hulu.
But when enslaved people continued to self-emancipate and presented themselves to Dunmore, he saw an opportunity to shore up his ranks by declaring he would free any enslaved person who agreed to fight against the colonists.
Dunmore issued that Emancipation Proclamation in November 1775, and that Emancipation Proclamation infuriated white Southerners, because this building is supposed to symbolize white rule over Blacks, and now the guy inhabiting that building has turned things upside down and is leading Blacks against whites.
So you have this situation where many Virginians and other Southern colonists, they're not really convinced that they want to side with the Patriots. And this turns many of them towards the revolution. Is that right?
If you ask them, it did.
404 years later, the United States is still a land of subjects and citizens. I mean, it's more subtle, of course, but the basic structure is still the same. White Americans, unless you are poor or disabled, enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. You can generally vote without impediment, as long as you're not a woke student who prefers the convenience of a drop box. Your family has never faced violent reprisals for trying to go to school or to work. You can live wherever you want without fear of reprisal, rejection, redlining, artificially reduced property values, or your neighbors calling 911 because they don't believe you live there. Historically, America's citizens have felt free to lynch, to riot numerous times from Reconstruction through the 1930s, all the way up to January 6, 2021. They have felt entitled to overthrow the government when they don't like the outcome of an election. As a citizen, the police generally serve and protect you, your property, and your social comfort. Citizens feel free to scream at the police when they're pulled over, or even to swing their fists at them. They get fed by the police after they gun down a church full of worshipers. They calmly surrender after committing a massacre. But those in this country who are still treated as subjects, Black folks, regardless of wealth or status, brown folks, AAPI Americans, poor white folks, non-white immigrants, and others who live at the margins of citizenship, live with the constant risk of housing and job discrimination based on your race, your social status, your hairstyle, or your last name. Higher interest rates and inadequate services in the zip codes you somehow always seem to get routed to. You might face discrimination at the airport and extra surveillance based on the outward manifestation of your religion. And then there is the often rude, dismissive, cruel, and too often brutal and sometimes deadly policing, which again was designed to control you and keep you socially confined to a status of inferiority and fear, regardless of how fervently you comply, how high you raise your hands, or how much you scream or beg or cry out for your mom. And it literally doesn't matter whether the police officer is white or looks like you, grew up like you, or could, without that uniform on, be you. It's not the race of the officer, it's the design of the system. Again, occasionally, some of the slave catchers were Black. Subjects endure the media and the National Guard, assuming they're in a riot at any moment, even though the cops who did the killing were arrested and charged. And even though it's the police who tend to break up Black vigils with tear gas and batons, not the other way around. Subjects face disapproving questions about what they did to cause their own death. Subjects fear for their children every day of their lives, even when by the grace of God they make it to adulthood, because they understand that at any day or time, they could meet up with the wrong cop on the wrong day and become the next hashtag. And subjects often turn their despair on each other or on their own communities. Those are the two Americas. And now you understand why the right doesn't want your kids to know this country's actual history, or for you to know it, because they fear that if you knew, you might want to do something about it. In fact, you might even demand it.